Morning.
Good morning.
How's it going? Good. Morning, Peter.
Misha,
Yes.
how do you actually know Susan personally? Had you
I've
met
never
her? Or,
no. She's a good friend of Jim's.
yeah, I thought maybe I saw the Yale connection. I thought
Yeah.
maybe you were part of that one too.
Good morning.
Good morning. How's it going, Daniel?
It's going well, thank you.
Good.
Well, yes, thank you.
טוב מאוד. יופי. Hi, Abba.
Hi, Misha. Hi, everybody else.
Hello.
Hello.
Nice to see you.
How's it going?
Good. Good day.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good morning. Hey, hi, Pam.
Boker Tov.
Boker Tov. Hey, Martin.
Hi.
It's going to send you these.
And some actors dressed as soldiers, but I don't remember much more.
It could be a whole bunch of my plays if it had actors dressed as soldiers.
Okay, sorry.
Unfortunately. Yes.
Where's Jim? I don't see Jim. Oh, there's Jim. Hey, Rabbi. Wait,
Hi, Susan.
he's
Susan,
muted.
good.
No, he's not muted. Hey. Yeah. Well, Misha, we did email about the whether we should do this just before the inauguration or not. And here we are.
You know, when you had initially wrote that, so when we wrote to Susan, we wrote with this date in mind, and we thought, you know, Martin Luther King weekend and everything. And Susan's response was, it's right before the inauguration and the world may have descended into madness by then, even more so. And I was a bit skeptical, and I'm totally eating my hat. And now I know to listen to you more.
Look, we still have plenty of things to say. And, you know, the truth of the matter, it's not part of my job description, but I mean, basically, since I came to the Einstein Forum and George W. Bush started the war in Iraq, I kind of function as, you know, the go-to American to talk about American news in the German media. We should remember, by the way, all of the cartoons that were flying around in November 2016, which said the happiest man in the country is George W. Bush because he will no longer go down as the worst president in American history. But anyway, so I have been doing a lot of reporting in the last few weeks. And, you know, since January 6th, one of my main lines has been, look, we expected the violence. He'd been, you know, broadcasting it, well, for a long time, but certainly throughout the campaign. What we did not expect was that a Jew and a Black man could win the Senate in Georgia. And I still want to emphasize that it's a bit of a, what shall I say, homegirl joy. I was born in Atlanta. John Ossoff is a member of the temple, the synagogue that I grew up in. Reverend Warnock kept referencing my childhood rabbi, Jack Rothschild, who was one of the very few people to stand up for Martin Luther King when most of white Atlanta did not. And you know, so I was really overjoyed. I did not dare to hope that both of them would win because that seemed to me too much to hope for. So I am still focusing. I kind of make it my business to, look for hopeful signs. But I'm also just still reeling from the news that I just read that the temple was cyber bombed again. I mean, I was 3 years old when it happened in Atlanta, so I wasn't aware of that. I was very aware of what happened later. Reverend, or I guess we have to call him Senator Warnock. Senator Warnock was yesterday supposed to give the Martin Luther King speech. This has been a tradition now at the temple for some years on Dr. King's birthday. And hackers cyberbombed it. They made it impossible and it was going to be played at the temple, but also, I mean, of course, since we're all living in cyberspace at the moment, it was going to be broadcast to many other synagogues in the country, and they blocked it. Now, they've now put it online if you want to see it. I haven't had a chance to watch it yet, but I'm kind of reeling from that. And I still want to point to that victory as perhaps the most important thing that happened on January 6th. But, it's also a sign that we're in trouble and this is going to go on.
I hear that. Yes. You know what? I'm gonna pause. I want to respond, but I'm gonna pause and just kind of welcome everybody for a sec, since we kind of dove in, and then we can dive kind of right back into those questions and these questions of January 6th and the book. But hi everybody, it's great to be with you all. Thanks for coming. We have a nice crowd. We got people from a few different countries. We got activists, people working on these issues here and in Israel and in Canada. So this is a happy gathering. Susan, I'm not gonna give you guys the entire Susan Neiman biography, but because I think you guys, most of you, if you're here, you kind of know it. But I think for our purposes, Susan has lived and taught in 3 countries that are, I think, germane to the reason that we are here. Which are the United States, Israel, and Germany. And she's the director of the Einstein Forum in Berlin and has been working on these questions of race and evil for a very long time. I think you guys probably all know, but I think it's worth stating, she grew up in Atlanta. While she was writing this book, Learning from the Germans, she spent all this time in Mississippi, and so she comes to us in a uniquely equipped kind of a position to help us make sense a little bit of what's happening in the world. I think a lot of us on this call have read at least parts of Learning from the Germans. Personally, I found it like there's so much information in this book. It felt to me, Susan, like you kind of worked like a painter in this book. It was kind of like, you're painting us a very rich painting, a picture of all these different landscapes of working on this question of memory and evil and redemption. So I have a lot of questions that I wrote down, and I've invited people to kind of come up with questions. But one of the beautiful things for me from reading this book was that it gave me certain answers, but most of all, it just enhanced the scope of my questions, and it's been a very rich experience for me, and I think for all of us, as we've had these pretty amazing discussions over the last few weeks, for all the people in the Chevruta from the New Shul. I want to, before I pass it on to Jim, to see if Jim's got more to introduce, and to kind of kick us off with either Jim or I will kick us off with a question to Susan. Our general kind of scheme today is we're going to start with some questions from me and Jim to Susan, and a kind of conversation, and then a little while into that, we're going to open it up for other people's questions. If you guys want to respond on the chat, you're welcome to do that. We'll try and kind of notice what's happening there. And if you're really eager to speak, I think maybe let's keep that to kind of the second half, and let's listen more to Susan in this first half. And the last thing I'll say before I pass it on to Jim is that we're a synagogue, and we are coming to this in a way from a faith perspective. And so I just kind of want to put that out there, that when I'm reading through this book, and I'm coming with the with this hat that I'm currently wearing, or this kippah I'm currently wearing of the rabbi, I'm trying to figure out some kind of religious questions, things like, what is our task? Things like, where am I blind? What am I not seeing? And then things that have to do with my relationship between myself and my ancestors, or myself and my history, and where do my ancestors and my history come into play today? And it's like really on that front, Susan, like an incredible gift. Your book really kind of really speaks to that in a very clear and concrete way. So thank you, Susan. Thank you so much for being here. This is really wonderful. And I'm going to pass it on to Jim, who knows you much better than I, so he can give a different kind of intro.
Well, let me just respond to your words, Misha, which I really appreciate, and I appreciate the painting metaphor. Actually, two totally different kinds of people have called the book a road movie, which I was very happy to hear. And because it was funny when I was writing the book, and friends would ask me, wait a sec, you're doing interviews? What kind of a genre are you working in? And I, it's not what philosophers usually do. And I said, I don't know, it's kind of a mishmash. And then somebody very kindly wrote a review that said I'd invented a new genre, investigative philosophy. So I said, oh yeah, so now I don't have to call it a mishmash. But I want to say one more thing, which makes me about faith, which makes me incredibly happy. And it's been one of the surprises for me in the reception of the book. I've been doing a lot of Zoom talks, which is fine. I've come to enjoy them. And next to colleges and universities, I have been incredibly surprised that the people who have most asked me are Jewish organizations, Holocaust-focused organizations, Holocaust research centers. I mean, including the one in DC. I'm supposed to, be the consultant on the exhibit for the Holocaust Center in Florida that got a lot of pushback for including George Floyd in an exhibit. They're now doing a big exhibit. And what this has made me feel is that the universalist tradition in Judaism, which is the one that I grew up in, and has not been as in evidence as I would like it to be, you know, in the last few decades. My Rebbe told me when we were corresponding about this question, he says the Jewish people have been at civil war over the question of universalism versus tribalism for our entire history. He may want to say more about this, but I have been incredibly moved to be asked by so many Jewish organizations to talk about this book. And I think universalism is coming back, Baruch Hashem, to the Jewish
Amen.
people.
Amen. כן יהי רצון.
Magnificent beginning. I have really nothing to say. I just want to remember a moment that you and I shared, Susan, in Berlin, in the aftermath of the Charleston massacre. I was teaching in a program called Fellowships at Auschwitz for the study of professional ethics. I had dinner, I believe, with you and Felix, your late husband. And we watched as the President of the United States, Barack Obama, spoke at the church in Charleston when the massacre had taken place. And we were weeping together, uncontrollably, as he sang Amazing Grace. Felix, I think, was in a slightly different place. I think he marveled at these crazy Americans. Austrian,
No, he
maybe
was
I'm
crying
wrong.
too. He was crying too.
Was he? Oh, good. Okay. I had my back to him, so I didn't feel his presence the way I felt yours. Thank you for that correction. That means a lot to me. So,
Felix
and-
and I have got to say, went to DC in January 2009 for the inauguration, for President Obama's first inauguration. So even though he wasn't an American, he felt that too.
you know, you are like Arendt, an historian, Monkey, and certainly a philosopher. Investigative philosophy is quite a term, but your control of details is critical. And this is an example for me. Thank you. You've changed my mental apparatus. So what I recall you said as we stood there weeping was, why is goodnit always so surprising? And I don't know if there was another adjective, but it captured the moment for me as we wept. And in a sense, your whole life has been immersed in the exploration of evil, which only means something because of goodness. And Arendt, who we both love and struggle with, says in her famous response to Sholem, who accused her of lacking sufficient love of the Jewish people, and also called her out for backing off from the reality of radical evil that Sholem seemed to think was the case, to a banality of evil, which he found to be a loathsome slogan. She said, I haven't backed away from radical evil. What I've discovered is that evil has no roots, it has no depth, but goodness does. Goodness goes deep. So, and when I recalled that conversation we had, I don't know if it was in a conversation in front of the television set in your apartment, you said it was at that moment, hearing Obama speak, that you determined that this project, which had been in the back of your mind, I think, probably most of your life, but that you said that was when I realized I had to get to it. So that's all I wanted to add as we go forward. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to see you like this and to be in this wonderful company of people. So Misha, I'm going to defer to you. Why don't your opening was magnificent. Please, query Susan, unless you want to. Susan,
Can I
of course,
add one remark to you, Jim? Because you corrected my memory on January 5th of this year by email. I didn't remember having said that, okay, about goodness. So this is why you have good friends. They remember things that you don't. Alana had sent me a note that Sunday saying, thinking of you as I'm doing phone banking in Georgia. And so on Tuesday night, when I was just in, I don't know what kind of a state I was in. And I was in conversation on email with a lot of people, actually. A Puerto Rican friend who's a lapsed Catholic, but who said she was saying Ave Marias. And so I wrote to you and I said, Rebbe, I hope you're praying for us. I'm tempted to pray, but I don't know how. And you wrote back immediately and said, give in to temptation. Remember the night that we stood together watching Obama's speech. And so I did what you told me. I made up a little prayer, because truly not just I'm a Georgia girl, so it means a lot to me personally, but truly the fate, not just of the United States, but seriously of parts, much of the world, depended on getting back a Democratic Senate who would not destroy Biden's agenda the way Mitch McConnell did Obama's. So I made up a little prayer, and I found the recording of Obama singing Amazing Grace on the internet, and I played it a few times and I went to bed. So, who knows? But yeah, thanks for your prayers, and thanks for telling me to give in to temptation.
I love that. Prayer as temptation, lesson number 1. Yes. So there's a couple people who put into the chat that they wanted a little kind of mini summary of the book, or what it's about. So I'll give a little. I'll give my little kind of version of this, and then maybe Susan, you can jump in and give yours. But the way I understand it is, Susan's been living in Berlin, and she describes in the introduction different time periods in which she visited Berlin, and how over the course of maybe 15 years or so, is that right? Something like that. Not too long a time period. It shifted from a place in which she didn't feel comfortable bringing up Jewish children in, to a place where she did. And the book is really talking about that generational shift. I think the book is a lot about generations and generations shifting. Basically, the second generation of Germans after the Holocaust managed to change their view from one of kind of denial and inability to deal into dealing with the history. And they've done quite impressive work since then. And that same process has yet to exactly happen in the United States, and we have what to learn from them. That's kind of that's the short version. And the longer version is that she's going through all these landscapes of what it was like in Germany, different, East Germany, West Germany, different time periods in Germany, then in the United States. She's in Mississippi. She's kind of moving around. She's talking about her childhood in Atlanta. So she's describing different attempts at dealing with these questions in the United States, including this time period that she spent at the University of Mississippi, at an institute, right, the Winter Institute, that's devoted really to these
racial reconciliation. It's called the Institute for Racial Reconciliation. Yeah.
There you go. Right. Okay. Does that sound about right, Susan?
That's fine. Let me add a few things because in many ways, this is a personal book, but I didn't want it only to be a personal book. There's philosophical reflection in it. There's quite a lot of historical information. The stuff about America was brand new for the German readers, and I know that the stuff about Germany is brand new for a lot of American and British readers. Jim is not quite right that I've been thinking about this stuff all my life, but I have been thinking about it since 1982 when I arrived in Berlin for what was meant to be a year as a Fulbright fellow, and I was working on a Kant dissertation, and I was planning to go back to Harvard in a year and get on the academic track. And there were very few Jews. I mean, there actually turned out to be a few more than I knew, but it was a handful of Jews. And then almost the only Americans in Berlin at the time were members of the occupying army. And of course, everybody from my mother to, my teachers, what's a nice Jewish girl going to spend an entire year in Germany? And my line at the time was, before I got there, hey, it's 40 years after the war. We can't blame the entire German people. And, it would be racist to do so. And therefore, I'm just going to go and think about Kant and Goethe. And, that's that. Well, I got really surprised because the war was not over in Germany. And the sort of people that I would naturally gravitate to anywhere, I should emphasize this is not the large part of the population, or it wasn't at the time, but intellectuals, activists, artists were obsessed with their Nazi parents and teachers. And it was the run-up to the 50th anniversary of what the Nazis call the power takeover. Americans should note that the Nazis came to power in a perfectly legal election, and then they destroyed democracy. So, it's a warning. We were running up to the anniversary, 50th anniversary, which would have been January 1930, well, it was 1983. And people were preparing to commemorate that anniversary. And it was not a government operation. It was very much a grassroots thing where people were making exhibits. They were exploring the history of their neighborhoods during the Nazi period. They were making films. They were doing plays, making art, and holding endless discussions. And I immediately asked myself, why have we stopped talking about the Vietnam War since it was over? Why have we never had a national conversation about Hiroshima? I was not thinking very far back into American history, but I was just immediately struck by the difference between what was going on, even in a fairly small proportion of the West German population, and what I had, noticed in the, last decades that I'd been a young adult in the United States. So I have been thinking about it since then, but and you're absolutely right. In 1988, when I left Berlin, so I wound up staying because I was fascinated. I did not go straight back to the academy. Really, the main reason that I stayed was I was fascinated with this process. As I would say regularly when I returned to my really very patient professors, say there's more philosophy in any bar in Berlin than I ever saw at a seminar at Harvard. It is a tribute to John Rawls, Stanley Cavell, and Burton Drebin, who were my mentors, that they didn't say, we've got other graduate students, Susan, you can take it where you like, but they said, tell me more, they were interested. So I really was fascinated by the ways in which philosophy and history and ethics were very much part of the public discourse in Germany as they still are today. But then I had my first child, and it did not, and various things happened. I talk about them actually, my very first book, which is called Slow Fire. And it did not seem to, Jewish Notes from Berlin is the subtitle. And it did not seem to me that even as a foreigner, and certainly not as a Jew, that, you know, I or my children could really have a normal life in Berlin. And so I went on the job market and I took a job at Yale, which is, you know, certainly led at least to one good thing, which is meeting Jim Ponette. And I was not particularly happy at Yale for various reasons, and various people, a number of, you know, Sabras who had since moved to New Haven and were friends of mine, but also people like Jim said, well, we get why you don't really feel, you know, that great in New Haven. You belong in Israel. And I should say I was just going through, well, I don't have to go through all the personal things that were also happening at the same time, but I thought I would try to, I would make Aliyah. I would see if I could get a job, which I did at the University of Tel Aviv. And I took 3 small kids and made Aliyah. And I have to stress that my decision to leave Israel was made in the year 2000 when Ehud Barak was prime minister, and there was still a peace process. And you know, my last night in Tel Aviv was actually Barak was you know, doing the unconditional withdrawal from Lebanon. So I did not leave Israel for political reasons. I just want to make that clear. I might have done later, but that was not my motivation. I was recruited to be the head of the Einstein Forum, which is this very unique, weird, I don't know, international, interdisciplinary public think tank is probably the best way to describe it. And it seemed to give me an opportunity to practice philosophy and continue to learn in the company of the really brilliant people I was expected to manage to invite to the Einstein Forum, but not be in an ivory tower, still, you know, be very much a part of the world. And of course, there was a huge question. My kids all considered themselves, after 5 years, they were quite young when we made Aliyah. They were 4, 4, and 9. So that's exactly the time period when you can take anybody from anywhere and turn them into an Israeli. So there was very much the question of, you know, what would this do to them, and you know, what might change my mind in the intervening 12 years. It was not an accident. There was a big change of government, which is terribly important. Okay, it's the first time since Willy Brandt that the Social Democrats had gotten into power. And, you know, the Social Democrats were persecuted and had to go into exile, as did communists, as did Jews when the Nazis came to power. So they were genuinely anti-fascists, and their attitude towards the Nazi period was a very different one than the preceding Christian Democrats. I know that my daughter, who lives in LA now, when I was giving a book talk there, said, "Ma, you can't say anything bad about Angela Merkel. She's a hero here." Well, she's done well as her chancellorship has progressed, but her party has not been on the right side of things at all. She has moved further and further towards the right side of things, but it was really the fact that the Social Democrats came to power in 1998, finally. And it wasn't just, I guess I'm trying to say is it's not just a generational change. These things don't happen simply because some people die and other people grow up. They happen for political reasons. They happen because grassroots activists basically work very hard. And, you know, as we can see in the American case, A change of generation after the Civil War didn't do it at all. On the contrary, it's produced iteration after iteration of lost cause ideology, which just culminated yesterday in the cyber bombing of the temple in Atlanta. Sorry to keep going back to that, but I'm just still kind of reeling. So I followed very closely. I made when the Einstein Corps made me the offer. I mean, I made 6 trips that year to Berlin to kind of see what it felt like, see if I felt that my children could grow up there without feeling they had to cower. And there was it's an anecdote, and I'll go beyond the anecdotal, but I guess I think the ability to pick the right anecdote is really, really important and plays a big role in our lives. And I was walking down the street at one of my interview negotiation reconnaissance trips, and in front of me, an African man. I knew he was African by his accent. He spoke good German, but the accent wasn't American, with very long dreads, was in front of me, and he was almost cut off by a car. It wasn't deliberate. It was just a bad driver. And the man said, in accented but perfect German, "Who gave you your driver's license, you idiot?" Actually used a stronger word than idiot, but we're in a synagogue. And that was this moment, that was this kind of epiphany for me, because I could not have imagined any foreigner talking back to a German on the street. We were all too nervous. And, that was a moment when I thought, okay, this will work. Partly, again, because of the political changes, partly because Berlin, in becoming the capital, had become much more international than it had been. So it is now the case that 20% of the population has at least one foreign-born parent. And that's, of course, important. Okay, we now have a lot of diversity that there wasn't in the 80s. But it was clear to me that there had been an enormous amount of hard work done. And some of the older generation had actually begun it. There just weren't enough of them. They began it in the late 50s. But it turned from this grassroots activity into a kind of wave where, first very unwillingly, and then with a sense of deep conscience. In fact, Angela Merkel has said, our commitment to Israel is part of the German raison d'etat, is the best. I don't think there's an English translation for the word. It is just a principle of our state, given our history. And so you get even a conservative politician. I know she doesn't look like a conservative politician from an American perspective. I have had to explain to people both here and in the US that Bernie Sanders' program is actually to the right of Angela Merkel's, but that's another story. I can go into it if you want, but let me say what I have when people ask me, so what is it that we can learn from the Germans that will help us? There are a lot of things, but I think the most important is that this stuff is really hard. So the Germans, as those of you who have read a bit of my book will know, they like long compound words, and they have this long compound word, Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, which I translate as working off the past. And it's a very manifold, many-layered and complicated process. even in the book where nobody was thinking about vaccinations, I wrote, this is not a vaccination. And now I'm kind of saying, maybe it's like a flu shot and you have to keep getting one every year, or, things mutate now that we're all thinking about vaccines. But it has many layers. It has to take place. Obviously, there needs to be some kind of an agreement on a national narrative. But that's something that doesn't just take place in school books, although that's very important. Popular culture is hugely important. What we see in film, what we see in music, what we listen to in music are equally important. Obviously, things like monuments, the iconography of our public spaces. Certainly, there are questions of justice. People who committed crimes need to be, or continue to commit crimes in the United States, need to be brought to justice. But I really have come to think that popular culture is actually the most important factor. And I had another little epiphany in November of 2018. It was too late to put in the book itself, but I did put it in the afterward. I had just handed in the manuscript of my book. My editor was relieved, no more changes, no more additions. And I was I had been invited, I was in the States, I'd been invited to a conference at Princeton. And then it turned out that the conference kind of conflicted with a memorial service for one of my teachers, Stanley Cavell, that was being held at Harvard. And I really wanted to go to that too. So there I was leaving a conference fairly late at night, and already tired, and it was pouring rain, and I was actually, I was on the New Jersey Turnpike, and I was afraid I was going to fall asleep at the wheel. So after having, drunk as many espresso as I could possibly stomach, I did what one might do in such a situation. I turn on the radio and I start singing very loud along with the radio. And suddenly there comes on Joan Baez's beautiful cover of The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, and I start singing. And then I think, wait a sec, this is a eulogy for the lost cause. Could I sing along if somebody was saying The Night They Drove the Wehrmacht Down? I could not. And the amazing thing about that is that Baez's civil rights creds are as good as they get. I mean, she not only famously sang at the March on Washington in '63, she sang in Selma when white people were being murdered for coming to Selma. So even Baez, could not escape this ideology that went into the popular culture, that, somehow it was a sad and noble thing. And, we can, so that stuff really matters a lot. And I do think the US has been making big strides in popular culture in the last couple of years. Maybe I should just go back for a minute to say, while I've been thinking about this stuff for a couple of years, Jim is absolutely right. That was the moment when President Obama made that speech that I decided maybe I can use my knowledge to illuminate what's going on in the States, because President Obama's speech was the first time that a national political figure had made a direct connection between the violence of the present and our repression of the violence of the past. And having grown up in the middle of the civil rights movement, that just was my childhood, deeply, and my, young and my adolescence. I know that people were too busy to think about history, there were too many things going on in the present. I could not swim in the same public lake with a Black child. Adults were being murdered. White adults were being murdered for helping Black adults to vote. And, we didn't have time to think about the residues of the past. The present was too dangerous and important. So it really wasn't until President Obama made that speech. I mean, obviously there were some books being written coming into the 21st century, but not all that much, where I would say that was the beginning of an American Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. Yeah. Second thing that I want to emphasize, besides the diversity that has to take place in any kind of facing up to a violent racist past, is, aside from the fact that it needs to be happening on all these levels, it's really hard. And one of the insights for me that was most important while working on this book happened when I started looking at the sorts of things that Germans, West Germans, we can come to that distinction later, it's very important. The East Germans did a much better job than the West Germans. I know that in our Cold War days, which are still as present as they were in the 50s, if not more, we can't imagine that anything good would ever come out of a communist country. As a matter of fact, East Germany was way better on this subject, but I'll just put that in brackets for the moment. West Germans in the first couple of decades after the war saw themselves as the worst victims of the war. Now, people were not shy when I first came to Berlin about telling me that their parents were Nazis or their teachers were Nazis. In fact, they talked about it all the time. And very often they had really screwed up family relationships. Many of them decided not to have children because their connection, to the whole idea of family, paternal authority, was, very, very problematic. But no one ever said my parents were Nazis and they thought they were the worst victims of the war. I had to read that. And, since I, did that research, I've of course asked people, why didn't anybody say this to me? Was it shame? And some people have said, yeah, I think you're right. I think we were ashamed of that. And other people have said, well, it was just so obvious. So here's what they said. We lost the war. Our cities were in ruins and ashes. The men who were, we lost 7 million people. The men who were not killed were in POW camps or they were wounded. Our children were hungry, just barely alive. I've given you the hint already. You should know what the reference is, those of you who ever listened to Joan Baez. And on top of it all, the damn Yankees blamed us for starting the war. And I suddenly realized these are the same tropes that you hear from the defenders of the lost cause, okay? It's just exactly the same attitude. So now comes the question, okay, all of us would like to see our people as heroes. That's natural. We want to see our parents as heroes. And the second stage is, if there's a big red flag and you can no longer see your parents or your nation as heroic anymore, you say, well, they were victims. They would have liked to have been heroes, but history turned them into victims. And that's absolutely natural, okay? What the Germans did that nobody had ever done before was to make a third step and say, yeah, we did suffer a lot towards the end of the war and after the war, but other people suffered more and it was our fault. Nobody's done that besides the Germans. But it was really hard for them to do. It took the West Germans 40 years till an official, the president of the country, which is different from the chancellor. We have a system that's more like the Israeli system, where we have a separate, it's a good idea, which Americans would come up with it, so that we would have a head of state that wasn't the same person as the president, but where the head of state said, May 8th which is the date of the end of the war, is a day of liberation from the Nazis. And he made this whole speech that at the time I thought was absolutely banal, because for anybody outside Germany, this claim, yeah, the Germans suffered at the end of the war, but other people suffered worse and it was our fault. They say, you know, this, you're telling us the water is wet or is the earth round? But it was a big deal in Germany. And I've told that to my friends in Mississippi who are activists and who know how hard it is to get Americans to acknowledge that, you know, our history was not, you know, one of, you know, unrelieved triumph, glory, decency, a light unto nations, and all of that stuff. And I said, look, people are going to resist. Now, you might ask why they have resisted so long in the United States, where it, you know, they were quicker in Germany. And there are lots of different explanations for that. One of them I said earlier, it's political. I mean, we have forces who are at work today trying to subvert the democratically elected government in the name of white supremacy. This is not a controversial statement anymore. You can hear it from Stephen Colbert or Arnold Schwarzenegger or, you know, some, you know, not your typical social democrat like me. But one interesting answer was given by my friend, historian of the Alabama Civil Rights Movement, Diane McWhorter, who said, look, we didn't really get rid of the legal institutions from slavery until the 1965 Civil Rights Act. And so if we're and it's true, one more remark. I know I'm going on and on. There are probably questions, but let me just say one more thing that I also think is really important. Then I'll stop and wait for your questions. So anyway, Diane's remark was, you know, if we consider the Civil War ending officially legally in 1965, we're not doing too bad compared to the Germans. For me, the biggest problem is that the lost cause created a black hole from 1865 to 1965. And the black hole was covered up by the word Jim Crow. I am on a campaign to get rid of the word Jim Crow. It's terrible, and plenty of African Americans use it, but it's a terrible euphemism. What do you think of when you think of the word Jim Crow? You think of a racist comedian in blackface, which is where the term comes from. You do not think of lynching. You do not think of penal servitude. You do not think of all of the legal ways in which African Americans were prevented from realizing their civil rights through terror. Brian Stevenson calls it the age of racial terror, and I think he's exactly right. So the question that we all had, you know, well, hey, the Civil War ended in 1865. What's the problem now? The problem is we didn't know our history, and I didn't know it until 2015 when I started to research these questions. So let me stop there and, you know, just ask if people want to ask anything else.
Thank you.
Open. I've got time.
Thank you. Thanks, Susan. That was incredible. Just, yes, thank you. Thank you for taking us through that. I do want to open it up to questions. And Erica's got one, but before that, it's just, there's an issue that I'm afraid we're not gonna touch on unless I put it forward, and it has to do with that transition that you described in German society. And the question has to do with art because we are in large part a synagogue of artists, and art plays a very big part in this. And I think that it's that the way that you describe the transition in the book has a lot to do with the role of artists, and the way that has happened in Germany. And so I wanted to ask you to speak to the interplay between art and artists, and the consciousness shift that happened there.
Well, I think it was probably incredibly important initially, although there were certainly German artists who were concerned with these questions. I think reading narratives initially of Holocaust survivors, people like Jean Amery, later on Primo Levi, were very, very important in just simply giving another perspective. This is what drives me so wild about the cultural appropriation debate. Art is what we've got that allows us into other people's, lives and perspectives. Once again, I've got to bring up the fact that in East Germany, there were over 1,000 films made about Nazi crimes, including the Holocaust. Occasionally, more than occasionally, East Germany is criticized because they say, well, they didn't talk enough about the Holocaust. They did talk about the Holocaust, but they did not consider it as the only Nazi crime. There were also 14 million Slavic civilians who were murdered, although most of them weren't murdered in gas chambers. Most Jews weren't murdered in gas chambers either, okay? So there were films about the Holocaust, but also about other war crimes, about other people's histories. 1,000 of them have been cataloged by people who care about this, when basically the West Germans were making movies that were the West German equivalent of Gone with the Wind. It was really, really striking. So the East Germans had that kind of popular culture. The West Germans first had a movie when that American series Holocaust was put on German television in 1978. Somebody asked me about the role of that series, and so I tried to watch it again recently, and I gave up after half an hour. It's really not good. I mean, by sort of movie standards, I use the word kitsch very rarely, because I think it gets used to dismiss a lot of good stuff that affects us emotionally. But that movie really is kitsch, even if it's got the young Meryl Streep in it. So, but it completely affected West Germany. It had a huge impact. There have been books written about it, that for the first time, instead of this, abstract number 6 million, they were following the lives of, 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 real people. And so that was quite powerful. I can't watch it, where I can still watch some of the old East German movies. I think some of them are artistically quite, good and moving and interesting. But the Germans first had to get it from outside before German artists, in a way that had a broad audience, could really do it. In the meantime, they've done a lot of it. I actually have to recommend a terrific film that I just saw, because I was asked to give the director got a prize, and I was asked to give the laudatio, and I so hated the title that I didn't even want to look at it. When Hitler Stole the Pink Rabbit, which was the name of a book by Judith Kerr, whose father was a fairly famous Berlin Jewish literary critic, and very radical. So they left Berlin shortly after the Nazis came to power and eventually wound up in England. That book is read now basically by every German school child. I've never read it myself, but I knew that there was this movie and I hated the title and I said, oh, okay, I'll look at it. It's a really good movie. I'm assuming that it will be translated and come to, because one of our last movies got an Oscar, and I'm, my guess is. So when it comes out, I can recommend it as a really beautiful example of a contemporary German film that just came out last year that could hold its own with anything, actually. Really terrific. I don't know if that answers your question enough. I mean, there was theater. I can remember, since I know you had started in theater, Misha, there was the longest running play in West Berlin when I first came to Berlin was called It Wasn't Me, Hitler Did It. And of course, it was an attack on that view that, the nation wasn't responsible. It was just a couple of bad apples at the top. I probably should have seen it again before it closed because I'm not sure I knew enough to appreciate it at the time, but it did run for 35 years in West Berlin. So, it was an off theater, obviously. It wasn't a big theater, but those kinds of efforts were already beginning certainly in the early 80s among artists. And there were visual artists as well. I love the work of Anselm Kiefer. If anybody knows his paintings, I think they're magnificent. Yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I think let's open it up. Anybody want to ask? Anybody want to put a question to Susan? Susan Berger, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. And I've read the book and appreciate it so much. We've traveled through some of the same terrain from very different places. My mother was born in Berlin, 1929. And if you know about the exhibit Ausgewiesen and the Poland action, which was the deportation of Polish-born Jew. In any case, that's part of my history. And my first home was in Shachmunis. Does that ring a bell for you?
No, what's that?
Oh,
Where's
that was the Arab town that University of Tel Aviv is located. Anyway, all right. I thought, but really, my question is, and because of the Ausgewiesen, there was an exhibit in Berlin in 2018 about this deportation. And the story is that in part they were deported to Poland, to the border, and there was a border town in Poland where the Polish people did the right thing. They were combined. It was a town, sometimes it was German, sometimes in Germany, sometimes it was Poland. So because it was a border town, I think there was something about their history, the diversity that enabled them to have moral courage. And it's a question of moral courage that I'm really interested in, not just in terms of the individuals, but there was a part in your book where you talk about, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, Niga, the man, the Buchenwald, the person.
Niga, yeah.
Niga, okay. So he talked about people having the freedom to make moral decisions. And he said something about we have to understand the structures within which enable them to do so. Mm-hmm. And if you have some ideas of what are the structures, you talked about the self-critical memory, that element that is encouraged and that somehow happened for the German people a certain kind of self-critical attitude, which has certainly been missing here, especially among certain segments. I think some people have that, but in any case, any further expansion on the idea of what are the structures that enable moral courage to flourish, not just for these individuals, but for communities, societies? That's sort of my question.
Well, it's a big and an excellent question. Let me, see what I can do to answer it briefly. I should say as a footnote, and this is a really interesting fact about Germany, I heard about that exhibit. I did not see it because there are so many exhibits about, the Nazi period, the pre-Nazi period, that happened so often in Berlin that I haven't seen, I'm not sure I've seen half of them, So that itself is a statement about what it takes to do this sort of thing. Moral courage, look, and this goes back to Jim's very initial question about moral goodness. Immanuel Kant, who I've written quite a lot about, I am still a philosopher, even if I don't do philosophy in the way that may be traditionally done. Immanuel Kant gives us a wonderful example. He says in his critique of practical reason, he said, let's take a man who says he's unable to resist temptation every time he walks by a certain house. This was the 18th century. It was clear that Kant was talking about a whorehouse, okay? He says he just is seized by temptation and he can't do anything but go in when he walks by a certain house. And then Kant says, well, consider the same man who is asked to write a letter condemning an innocent person to death by a tyrant, who's a tyrant, but still there's a kind of legal framework, so he needs a piece of proof. And the tyrant says, if he doesn't sign that letter, he himself will be executed. And what Kant says is, none of us know what we would do in that situation, but all of us know that it would be possible to refuse to sign the letter, even in the face of death. And that proves human freedom. That's Kant's proof of human freedom. It's really quite interesting. Because he builds it up with some very technical language, and you think, okay, he's going to give us a transcendental deduction, which will show us. He doesn't. He gives us an example. And I've got to say that, one thing that I learned from that example is human freedom is a mystery. Moral courage is a mystery. And it really does come down to individual people standing up and saying no or yes, depending on the circumstance. I am staring right at my good friend David Schulman, and I don't want to embarrass him, Misha's father, because I know he absolutely hates it. I've written about him in another book and his activities in the occupied territories, but I would recommend his book, Freedom and Despair, as an example of, just practical day by day moral courage, where one of the things that David emphasizes is that it often looks quite boring and banal. It's not necessarily a matter of planting a flag on a rampart. It's getting up and doing a little bit of what one can in one's own neighborhood to stand up for justice. And I don't think there's an accounting of it. I mean, the Bulgarian French philosopher, critic, whatever you want to call him, Svetlana Todorov, wrote a good book called Facing Extremes, in which he tried to explore the question of what allowed some people to stand up to the Nazis and also to some of the worst of the Soviet regime. And he comes up with a lot of stories, but he also doesn't come up with, there aren't any structures. I mean, there are different structures everywhere. And it's quite important, obviously, if you want to act politically, to figure out what your local structures are and how you can move them. I'm not one for sort of just abstract principles that don't go anywhere. You need to know how the political situation works. But in the end, it really does come down to this moment of freedom.
Thanks for that beautiful question and that beautiful answer. Lori's got her hand up and Erica's got a question, but I just want to check in with Jim, because I know, Jim, you gotta take off in a few minutes to go to a memorial. I just wanted to see if you want to say anything or ask anything.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Misha. I do have a memorial that I'm going to have to leave for in a few minutes. This has been magnificent. I don't want to take any people's time. Thank you.
Okay. Lori, why don't you go and then we'll go to Erica.
Yes, thank you for a wonderful talk. I was wondering if you can speak about the anti-Semitism in Germany today. Number one, the rise is rising, I seem to believe, and two, how you feel as a Jew living in Germany, in Berlin.
So number one, it's not rising. It's just been a new report out. I know that that's what you read, but actually a new book that does talk about anti-Semitism has 80 pages of documentation that the incidents have actually gone down in the last 10 years or so. I'm not fond of the official organization of the German Jewish community, though to my great surprise, they heard me talking about Trump on television last week and actually asked me to write for their paper. I was so surprised that I had to ask, do you know who I am? Do you know what else I write? It's a very conservative organization. But one of the heads of that organization, and I forget which one it was, said a couple of decades ago, look, if your child nearly died of pneumonia, you're going to be more worried every time she catches a cold. And that's right, you know. So I understand that people look to, you know, signs of anti-Semitism in Germany and worry about it more than they would elsewhere. There's also, as I'm sure you've read, we have a right-wing party in parliament for the first time since a far-right party, based mostly on the immigrant wave of immigrants that we took in. Interestingly enough, and I find this perfidious, and frankly, we saw this, those of you who follow Israeli politics a little bit in the case of Efi Eitam, we saw this in the United States. We keep seeing this in the United States. There is a serious attempt of certain right-wing people to deflect attention from their own other forms of racism by pointing to the Holocaust. And I could go on for a long time about that, but I'm sure for those of you who have been following the current occupant of the White House, whose name I refuse to say, you will think of many such examples. Although we have a right-wing party, so what's interesting about this right-wing party is they try to recruit Jews. They've tried very hard to recruit Jews. They even tried to recruit me. And I had to tell them, I'm sorry. No, not I'm sorry. I said, you're not going to get me with your Islamophobia towards Syrian refugees. I'm not so-and-so. So-and-so is another German Jewish writer born in Germany who has moved very far to the right. And this guy from the AfD looks at me and said, oh, do Jews have different opinions? I hope you all know how funny this is. I mean, it is, after all, a traditional Jewish joke, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, right? But the far right party has tried to bring Jews in to cover the rest of its racism. They have not succeeded, of course, with the exception of a tiny number of Russian Jewish immigrants who, are also Islamophobic. It is also the case that despite that party, the number of Germans who are actively engaged in helping refugees integrate is way higher than anybody who voted for that party. And I also have to say, I'm even not going to make any comparisons to the United States. If I look at our neighbors, unfortunately, in Poland, in Hungary, in Austria, in Switzerland, and in France, their right-wing racist parties are larger than ours. And I attribute that to this process of Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. I'm glad that Germans are worried about anti-Semitism. They are, and they're worried about this right-wing party. But I'm not. I mean, not really. Anti-Semitism, unfortunately, has risen all over the world in the last decade. We all know it as Jews, and there are lots of reasons for it. But to focus on Germany is a real mistake. And how do I feel as a Jew in Germany? Oh, Lord. Happier than I did as a Jew in Tel Aviv, I gotta say it. Because as a Jew, who came to Israel because I thought I was going to feel at home there, finally, after having not felt at home as a Jew born in Georgia, and not felt at home in Berlin of the 80s. I did come with the expectation that I was going to feel at home. Like most Jews born, I mean, almost virtually every Jew born in the diaspora, unless they're ultra-Orthodox, I did not. And I decided that actually I do conform to a type there. And it's a Nazi expression. I sometimes use it, and I use it tongue in cheek, I'm a rootless cosmopolitan Jewish intellectual. That's what I am. And there are, fortunately, especially in the generation that's a bit, I guess, about your age, Misha, so the Jewish community in Berlin is the largest fastest growing Jewish community in Europe. And it's quite interesting. There's a range of people. They're from, the Lubavitchers are here, Chabad is here. There are Orthodox Jews from Britain, fairly large number who have Orthodox Jews, Orthodox schools where somebody I know finally pulled her children out because they didn't want to teach dinosaurs in elementary school because dinosaurs aren't in the Bible. So they're those kinds of Jews, but it's mostly, we have an estimated 30,000 Israelis in Berlin. Many of them in quite important places of power, running theaters, forming German Jewish newspapers and groups. I was just told that Edgar Keret, who's, one of the best known Israeli writers of the younger generation, is moving to Berlin on political grounds. So my hope is, especially among, I was just talking to an Israeli friend who lives between here and New York, but he's here as often as he can be. And I was just talking, half a year ago, and said, Omri, we don't have a critical mass, we need a critical mass of Jewish intellectuals and artists. And, I'm beginning to think, especially around people in their 40s, we're getting a critical mass, and things, are happening in this country that I, could not have imagined in the 80s. So I feel fine. This is not to say that I have encountered genuine anti-Semitism. I have encountered polite philo-Semitism, which I sometimes find more annoying. I have also encountered, I just saw David smiling, he knows about this. There are many Germans, mostly conservative ones, but not only, who really feel that any criticism of Israeli politics is, is a place they cannot go. Jürgen Habermas, Germany's greatest living philosopher, said that long ago. It's not my place to criticize Israeli politics. And it has been said, very, very often, and it's quite problematic. I mean, it went so far as to take away funding from an Israeli art student at the Berlin Art Academy for a project she started with the title Unlearning Zionism. And, all the bells and whistles started ringing, and they actually canceled her project. I'm part of a group of cultural organizations who is pushing back on that. We have gotten considerable amount of criticism, but we've also gotten a lot of solidarity, for saying, I get that you feel committed to Israel. I get that you want to make up for the sins of your fathers and your grandfathers. But it's my view, and I know it's the view of many people, I of course only know a few of the people I'm looking at, that anyone who loves Israel has got to criticize the way that it has been going for, unfortunately, quite a long time, certainly for the last 20 years. And so we've gotten a lot of kickback. I've gotten a lot of abuse. Self-hating Jew is the least of it. But we're moving even there. And it's very important. That is, for me, kind of the last point on which Germany had to, open up. And instead of having this kind of knee-jerk, well, our parents and grandparents were Nazis, so I love Woody Allen. I mean, I literally sat next to, I think I tell this in the book, I didn't like Woody Allen even before all the sex scandals. I think he's not just misogynistic. I think he's misanthropic in many of his films. So I never particularly. I think he did one or two really good movies, but I was never a fan. But I mean, I literally have sat next to people at dinner parties saying, "We love Woody Allen." It's kind of like if any of you saw the movie Get Out. Which I thought was a terrific movie. And, again, one of the newer things that American popular culture is doing where, the sinister white father, greets all his black guests who he's about to murder by saying, I would have voted for Obama for a third term, So you do sometimes get that kind of thing, but it's changed. It's changed very much. And I feel fine.
Thanks. Thanks, Susan. We're kind of running out of time, but Erica had a question.
I'll try to make it quick. I'm interested in what you said about victimization and what that does to the psyche. So that what you were saying earlier on about, how did you put it? We are the ones who suffered the most in the Second World War. And I'm kind of interested in how that applies here in America and in the United States. How does the mentality around victimization, how do we, when you think about like, okay, what is the cultural work or the grassroots organizing work we have to do to shift what's happening here so that there can be a reckoning on a national scale? And I think a lot of the people on this call are really interested in what they can do to be part of that shift. And so I'm thinking a little bit about, one of the things in the way of that shift is victimization, or a sense that you suffered. And then it's incredibly hard. In my work, I do restorative justice work on the individual scale. And so I try to help people as individuals deal with their levels of accountability. And what's often in the way of that is if they have tremendous criminal sanctions coming their way, they're too defensive to acknowledge what they've done. So what I have to do is try to remove some of those barriers so that they can have the space to reflect on what they have done and really articulate that. And so I see victimization. So if you're being victimized by the criminal justice system, you're not able to acknowledge the things that you did. And so I don't want to project too much from an individual to a nation, because that's a huge projection. It's a different trajectory, and the political implications or needs at the nation level are much different. But I am really interested in what you saw in Germany as a way, because everything you said of like what the Germans went through in the Second World War is true. We suffered this, right? Yes, you did. We suffered this. Yes, you did. We suffered. So it's like, it's true what they're saying, but then you have to make space for that next sentence. And I think here we're dealing a lot with people who are stuck at the end of that first part of the sentence, but I suffered this, and they can't go any further. And so they're turning to people who acknowledge that first part of the sentence and just stopping the conversation there. What I would like is to be able to make room for more people in the sentence, more experiences in how you imagine your community. So anyway, I'm just really interested in what happened in Germany that made room for people. Was it the Marshall Plan? Well, what was it in the East Germany, right? Like, what was it? I don't know the answer. To make room for people to say, my experience, yes, and somebody else's experience, because I think that might help us here.
So this is a great question. Let me try to answer it quickly. First of all, I'd love to hear more about your work, if you've written anything about it, or if we could maybe talk sometime, because I think individual work is incredibly important. I saw it happen, when I was in Mississippi, talking to other activists, following activist groups who are doing restorative justice and racial reconciliation work. I think it's, one short answer is that, in Germany, it went person by person to some degree. Let me just, the Marshall Plan played almost no role at all. And let me just put a word in. I know that there's so much to cover. We did not get to the subject of East Germany. East Germany did not get the Marshall Plan at all. East Germany had the burden of paying war reparations to Poland and Soviet Union. And it is the main thing that slowed up their economy. Okay, just for a short. What you had in East Germany was a genuine anti-fascism. You probably all know the famous quote of Pastor Martin Niemöller. First they came for the communists, but I wasn't a communist, so I did nothing. And then they came for the socialists, and I wasn't. And I used to see that on walls in college. The message is a good one. There's a principled message. If anybody's civil rights are threatened, eventually everybody's civil rights will be threatened. But we forget to take it historically. First, they really did come for the communists, and then they really did come for the socialists. And anti-communism, anti-socialism was as fundamental a pillar of Nazi ideology as anti-Semitism was. And that has been, there's one good book in English by Arno Meyer, Why Did the Heavens Not Darken, that you can read if you're interested in this subject, or you can read my chapter in Learning from the Germans. It's been wiped out both in West German and in American discussions of the rise of the Nazis. So what that meant is that when the people who ran the East German government came back either from exile or from concentration camps, which is where they'd all been, they were genuinely anti-fascist. They were not people who thought this was okay, in great contrast to the people who ran West Germany for 40 years, okay? So what they did was to immediately put in a national program of re-education. They renovated the Buchenwald concentration camp, turned it into a memorial and an archive and a research center. Every German child had to go there at some point in their school years. They did do a lot of film. They did do wrote a lot of books. One problem was, and on the whole, they did a better job, but part of the problem was it came from the top, you know? And because, of course, you know, there were other problems with East Germany. It was an authoritarian state, partly because they were very, very afraid of what to do with a population that had spent 12 years under Nazi propaganda, many of whom, of course, for quite a while were still believing it. They kept the lid on quite tight. And what that meant is that coming from above, it did have an impact. I interviewed many East Germans in writing the book. But in a certain way, things that come from the bottom up, things that come from the grassroots, things that you work out for yourself are better. And part of that is, of course, the individual work that I gather just from the few remarks. We never met, so I don't know exactly what you do, but I hope we will. You know, I'm also writing a book, I have to say, about heroes and victims. And perhaps the last thing I'll say, because you've raised, you know, you've just opened a huge, we could talk for a good hour about that itself. I think we need heroes. And I think we should not forget, in remembering the victims of any racist crime, to remember also the people who stood up against them. So that for me, the most important part of the monuments debate is less which monuments come down than what we put in their places. And why do we need heroes? We need heroes because they show us that actual men and women truly stood up to embody the values that we want to hold and pass on to our children. And we need those reminders. And one of the more interesting, surprising things that Brian Stevenson, who, by the way, when you can travel again, the pictures don't do it justice. It is worth a trip to Montgomery, Alabama, just to see the National Lynching Memorial. It is awesome in the genuine sense of the word awesome. It's just the greatest piece of memorial art I have ever seen in my life. And I had the privilege of interviewing Brian before he got so busy that it's impossible for him to answer all the requests, because the museum and monument was still under construction. And one of the things he said to me that really resonated was, there were white people in the South who stood up against lynching, and you don't know their names. And those names need to be remembered. And the fact that you don't know them says everything, you know, that needs to be known. So and one of the things that the monument does so powerfully in Montgomery is the victims of lynching are you know, they're honored in a way that I think almost everybody who goes there, I've heard this from other people, winds up in tears. But you walk out with a sense of hope because there are also different quotes and different monuments to the people who stood up in the struggle against racism. And both of those things are terribly important. We had the question about moral courage. You know, it always helps to remind ourselves that other people were there before us and, you know, stood up on the right side. Now, so I feel like we've gotten into a paradigm where heroes only belong to the right, you know, and the left is victim focused. And that's obviously it's an improvement over the kind of history writing where, history was written by the victors and the only memory of the victims was, yeah, well, too bad. So it is, of course, important that we switch to historical paradigm to remember the victims. But I do think we've gone too far since the middle of the 20th century. And I'm currently writing about why we need heroes. I assume that, we don't have much more times. People have been making it's time to go noises. I loved your question, and I hope I've given you just a tiny bit of an answer about it, because I do think it is the real question. Maybe I'll throw in one more thing. I will throw in one more thing. Sorry. Anybody is free to go, of course, if they want to. I'm trying to think about repairing America. I have been thinking about the function of rage. And I don't think those of you who live full time in America actually notice it. I mean, except when you see it vividly at the Capitol. I see it as an American who lives abroad every time I go back. And it's not just, the poorest people, the people who are in fact most victimized. I see it all over the place. And I do think there's a political solution. How viable it is, I don't know. Americans, including Americans with good jobs, who are in the middle class, do not have a system of social rights. If they're lucky, they have what's called benefits. That's a completely different concept than what Europeans have. And I am not talking about Scandinavia. That's where Bernie Sanders made his mistake. I'm talking about the fourth largest economy in the world, namely the Federal Republic of Germany. Now, people followed our debates about America, about Obamacare. So they know that Americans don't have universal health insurance. But I've had to tell them during the pandemic that we don't have universal sick leave. And they look at me as if I would tell them, we chop up little babies and eat them for dinner. That is, they don't see this as being too bad. They think it is brutal, barbaric, and crazy. And I think the level of rage that you can find in the supermarket or the road or, wherever you find it in America, that when you live long enough in America, you get used to it, because of course they're wonderful people and there are good things that happen. And so you just kind of deflect the rage. I think there's a real solution to it. I think Americans, even the ones that don't have to work 2.5 jobs to, keep from being evicted, I think Americans feel that their lives are missing something deeply, and they don't realize that an entirely different social system would be possible. And you know, so I think part of the answer to the white supremacists, many of whom really are victimized, it's just they're not being victimized by Black people or immigrants. They're being victimized by a brutal system. If as many of us as possible can make that point, I think we could make a difference. And now I guess I'm talked out.
Thank you for talking yourself out for us, Susan. Yes, I could stay and listen more and more, but I think we're gonna wrap. I want to really thank you deeply from the heart, from all of us. This was really wonderful to hear your thinking on all this, and I hope that your book and your words help us do the work that we need to do to start making the shifts that we so need here in the US. So thank you everybody for being here. And if you guys want to unmute and yell out a thank you or write something in the chat to Susan. So
The chats always disappear. Can you save the chat for me? Because I see there are interesting chat, notes here, but I haven't had a chance. I don't know how to save them, but if you can figure it out, send them to me. I'd be curious to know it.
I've actually copied and pasted every single thing from the chat because of exactly that. So I have
Thanks
them
so
for you.
much.
Thanks, Susan.
Susan, thank you so much for your brilliance and generosity and reflections and spontaneity and willingness to play with us.
Well, it's been a real pleasure. So yeah, maybe another time, and keep the faith. What can one say in these times? Yeah.
Many-
Thank you. It's been a privilege.
Thank you. Yes,
Sure.
privilege.
Thank you so much.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you.
Thank you, Misha, for organizing this.
Yes, thank you, Misha. It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you, Misha.
To the neutral.
Yeah.
Vielen Dank. Vielen Dank. Auf
Nix-
Wiedersehen.
Niks te danken.
Thank you, Susan.
And this year is also a celebration of 1,700 years of Jewish life in Germany, isn't that right?
Oh, thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to everybody.
Thanks.
She was interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much. Thank you.
That was the neighborhood.
No.
Nope.
In your pajamas is.
Thank you so much.
So good and so important. Thank you.
All right, let's say thank you. Thank you so very much. So informative.
Thank you.
Shall we?
Yeah.
Thank you, Susan.